Now, one royal mystery solved, another blown wide open. The skeleton dug up in a Leicester car park 2 years ago has now been proven to be Richard III after new DNA tests on 2 of his descendants.
For 500 years, Richard III was remembered as England's twisted villain, a killer king, buried by his enemies and immortalized by Shakespeare as a monster. Then archaeologists opened a Leicester car park and found the body history had tried to erase. His DNA confirmed the king, but it also exposed something darker, a hidden break in the royal bloodline that could shake centuries of British history from within. What the DNA really rewrote. The real reason Richard III's DNA shook history is not because it gave us a simple scandal. It did the opposite. It made the story more complicated, and that is what real evidence often does. First, the DNA identified the lost king with extraordinary confidence. That alone was historic. A man turned into myth was brought back into the physical world. He was no longer only a character from a play, a portrait, or a Tudor accusation. He was a skeleton, a spine, a skull, a set of wounds, and a genetic profile. That matters because physical evidence has a way of humbling stories. Second, the skeleton corrected the body myth. Richard did have scoliosis, but the monstrous hunchback image was propaganda and theatre. His body had been distorted twice, once by disease and again by enemies. The first was medical, the second was political. Third, the Y chromosome mismatch exposed the weakness of royal bloodline certainty. It did not tell us exactly which generation carried the break, but it proved that somewhere, documented descent and biological descent did not align. That is enough to challenge the romantic idea of dynastic purity. And fourth, the discovery forced people to separate 3 different kinds of legitimacy: biological, legal, and political. A person can be biologically descended from someone and still lose power. A person can have a weak blood claim and still become king by victory. A person can be legally recognized as legitimate even if biology is uncertain. Medieval monarchy was never just DNA. It was war, law, church approval, marriage, propaganda, and survival. That is the deeper original twist. Richard's DNA did not prove that blood decides history. It proved the opposite. For centuries, kings acted as if blood made power natural, but the science shows that blood is messy, hidden, and sometimes unknowable. What actually holds dynasties together is not pure biology. It is recognition. It is paperwork. It is political force. It is the story people agree to believe. That is terrifying because it means history can be built on confidence that no one had the tools to check. The bones under Leicester did more than identify Richard. They exposed how vulnerable history is when written by winners. The Tudors painted Richard as a monster. Shakespeare made the image unforgettable. Generations repeated it. Then a skeleton under a car park quietly pushed back, not by speaking, but by existing. Richard was not proven innocent of every accusation. That would be too easy. But he was no longer the cartoon villain history had sold. He was a young king, killed in battle, buried without honor, physically disabled but capable of war, genetically identified after 5 centuries, and connected to a royal bloodline mystery that no chronicler could have imagined. In the end, the most frightening thing Richard III's DNA revealed was not that one royal ancestor may have lied. It was that history itself can lie for centuries and still look official. The king buried under ordinary asphalt. For centuries, people walked over Richard III without knowing it. Cars parked above him. Shoppers passed nearby. The city of Leicester moved on with ordinary life, while one of England's most controversial kings lay beneath modern asphalt, hidden under the place where the medieval Greyfriars Church had once stood. That image is what makes this story so powerful. Richard III did not vanish into a royal tomb, a grand cathedral, or a carefully guarded vault. He disappeared into the ground after defeat. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he became the last English king to die in battle. His body was brought back to Leicester, humiliated, and buried without the ceremony expected for an anointed monarch. Then time did what time always does. The monastery was destroyed during the Reformation. The buildings vanished, The grave was lost. The king became a story more than a body. But stories are dangerous when enemies write them. After Richard died, Henry Tudor became Henry VII and founded a new dynasty. The Tudors had a problem. Their claim to the throne was not simple, clean, or unquestionable. They needed Richard to be more than defeated. They needed him to be evil. Over time, that political need hardened into legend. Richard became the twisted villain, the ambitious uncle, the killer of all, the monster. Shakespeare later turned him into one of the most famous villains in English literature, a poisonous figure whose body and soul were both bent. For hundreds of years, that image stuck. For hundreds of years, that image stuck. Richard III became less a man than a warning, a king with a crooked back and a crooked heart, a ruler whose name was tied forever to the princes in the Tower, a man blamed for crimes that remain among the most famous unsolved mysteries in British history. Then Philippa Langley believed the body could still be found. That sounds simple now because we already know what happened. But before 2012, it sounded almost impossible. The grave had been lost for centuries. The city had been rebuilt. Roads, buildings, mau and car parks covered the old religious landscape. Yet Langley and researchers connected historical records, old maps, and the likely position of the Greyfriars Church. The search pointed to a municipal car park in Leicester. In August 2012, the University of Leicester archaeological team began digging. On the first day, they found human bone. It sounds almost too dramatic, but that is what makes the discovery feel like history, reaching up through the dirt. The team had not uncovered treasure, they had uncovered a skeleton. And as they studied it, the evidence began lining up in ways that felt impossible to ignore. The skeleton that answered Shakespeare. The remains were called Skeleton 1. At first, that name sounds cold and clinical, but the bones began telling a story more emotional than any legend. The grave was crude. The body had not been laid out with royal dignity. The grave appeared too short. The position was awkward. This was not a careful burial designed to honor a king. It looked like the rushed disposal of a defeated enemy. Then came the wounds. The skulls showed severe injuries consistent with medieval battle. The body suggested a man who had likely lost his helmet or been overwhelmed at the end. Richard died at Bosworth after his final charge failed, and the bones carried the violence of that moment. This was not the clean death of a royal portrait. It was brutal, close, physical, and humiliating. But the most famous clue was the spine. For centuries, Richard had been described through the language of deformity. Tudor writers and Shakespeare exaggerated him into a monstrous figure, turning his body into evidence of moral corruption. The skeleton did show scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine that would have made one shoulder higher than the other. But it did not show the cartoonish hunchback of legend. It showed a real medical condition that had been turned into propaganda. That is one of the most important emotional shifts in the story. The bones did not erase Richard's physical condition. They humanized it. They showed that there was truth under the exaggeration, but also cruelty in how that truth had been used. Richard was not the grotesque creature of Tudor imagination. He was a man with scoliosis, who still rode, wore armor, and fought in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. That changes the way the audience sees him. A curved spine no longer becomes proof of villainy. It becomes proof of endurance. Whatever Richard did or did not do politically, his body was not a moral confession. It was a body, a painful, human body. And for the first time in centuries, science was stripping away the theater. But bones could only take the identification so far. The age matched, the wounds matched, the scoliosis matched, the location matched. Still, if the team wanted certainty, they needed DNA. That is where the story moved from archaeology into genetics. The DNA that brought a dead king back. Extracting DNA from 500-year-old remains is not simple. Bones buried in damp soil for centuries do not hand over clean answers. Ancient DNA can be degraded, contaminated, fragmented, and difficult to interpret. One careless touch can complicate the work. That is why the team needed careful methods and the right kind of genetic comparison. The strongest path was mitochondrial DNA. Unlike the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, mitochondrial DNA passes through the maternal line. Richard III had no surviving legitimate children, but he had a sister, Anne of York. If researchers could trace an unbroken female line from Anne down to living people, they could compare those living descendants' mitochondrial DNA with the DNA from skeleton 1. That genealogical work led to Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker living in London, and Wendy Duldig, another female line descendant. Their role in the story is almost unbelievable because it connects ordinary modern lives to one of the most famous royal mysteries in England. A king lost under a car park could be identified in part because distant relatives carried a genetic signature passed through women for generations. When the results came back, the maternal evidence was powerful. Skeleton 1's mitochondrial DNA matched Michael Ibsen and also matched Wendy Duldig, with a small difference consistent with a mutation across generations. Combined with the grave location, battle wounds, scoliosis, age, radiocarbon evidence, and historical context, the conclusion became overwhelming. The body under the car park was Richard III. That should have been the end of the mystery. The lost king had been found. The skeleton confirmed the scoliosis. The wounds told the story of Bosworth. The DNA tied him to his family. England had recovered a king who had been physically missing for over 500 years. But science did not stop there. Researchers also looked at the Y chromosome, the genetic marker passed from father to son. For royal dynasties, the male line carried enormous symbolic weight. Medieval kingship was not only about law, conquest, politics, marriage, and recognition. It was also wrapped in the idea of blood. Houses claimed legitimacy through descent. Noble families traced male lines back through centuries. Names like Plantagenet, York, Lancaster, Tudor, and Beaufort were not just labels. They were weapons in the fight for power. Richard III belonged to the House of York, part of the Plantagenet dynasty. His great-great-grandfather was Edward III. The researchers compared Richard's Y chromosome with modern male line relatives connected through the Somerset family, descended from the Beaufort line, and ultimately linked on paper to Edward III. The expected result was simple. If the documented male line was biologically unbroken, the Y chromosomes should match. They did not. The royal bloodline that did not match. The Y chromosome mismatch is the part of the story that sounds like a historical bomb going off. Richard's maternal DNA helped confirm who he was, but his paternal DNA did not match the modern male line relatives expected to share the same male ancestry. In genetic terms, this suggests a false paternity event somewhere in the documented family tree. That phrase sounds clinical, almost polite. A false paternity event means that at some point, a child recorded as the son of one man was biologically the son of another. In everyday language, it means an affair, secrecy, mistaken paternity, or a hidden break in the male line. In royal history, it means something much more dangerous. It means the bloodline on paper may not match the bloodline in the body. But this is where the improved script has to be sharper than the competitor. The mismatch does not prove exactly where the break happened. It does not automatically prove Richard III was illegitimate. It does not automatically prove Edward IV was illegitimate. It does not automatically prove the current monarchy is genetically invalid. The break could have happened in Richard's line, in the Beaufort-Somerset line, or somewhere else between the common ancestor and the modern comparison. That uncertainty is what makes it more terrifying, not less. If the DNA had pointed to one exact affair, the scandal would be cleaner. Historians could place it in a single generation and argue about one person. Instead, the mismatch opens a shadow across multiple generations. Somewhere in this revered royal tree, the paperwork and the biology separated. Somewhere, a child inherited a name, a title, and a place in history that genetics could not confirm. That does not mean medieval kingship was decided by DNA the way modern people imagine. No medieval court was running genetic tests. Legitimacy was legal, political, religious, and social. A child publicly accepted as legitimate could inherit power even if biology told a hidden story. That is the real twist. DNA does not simply rewrite history by saying one king was fake. It rewrites history by exposing how fragile the whole idea of pure blood really was. For centuries, dynasties sold themselves as natural facts. They claimed the right to rule through birth, lineage, and divine favor. But Richard's DNA reminds us that royal bloodlines were human systems built on human bodies, human secrecy, human politics, and human weakness. They were not sacred machines. They were families, and families have secrets. That is why the phrase rewrites 500 years of history works if handled carefully. The DNA does not rewrite every event. Richard still ruled. Henry VII still defeated him. The Wars of the Roses still happened. The princes still disappeared. But the DNA rewrites the confidence behind the story. It shows that the bloodline, everyone treated as solid, may have contained a hidden fracture. The terrifying secret is not one confirmed scandal. It is the possibility that power was built on a family tree no one alive could fully verify. The princes, the Tudors, and the propaganda machine. Once Richard's body was found and his DNA tested, the question of his reputation came back with new force. For centuries, Richard III has been tied to the fate of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. They were the sons of Richard's brother, Edward IV. After Edward IV died, the boys were placed in the Tower of London, and Richard eventually took the throne. The traditional story says Richard had them killed to secure his crown. That version became central to his villain image. It is dramatic, simple, and politically useful. The uncle kills the nephews, steals the throne, then receives divine punishment at Bosworth when Henry Tudor defeats him. But history is rarely that clean. Richard's defenders point out that his claim to the throne did not depend only on killing the princes. He took power after his brother's marriage was declared invalid, which made the boys illegitimate in legal terms under the act known as titulus regius. If they were already legally barred from the throne, then the crime motive becomes more complicated. That does not clear Richard. It simply means the case against him is not as simple as the Tudor version made it appear. Henry VII also had motive. His own blood claim to the throne was weak, and he needed to unite the houses after taking power. He married Elizabeth of York, the sister of the princes, strengthening his claim through the Yorkist line. If the princes were alive, they could become dangerous symbols for rebellion. Their existence would threaten the new Tudor settlement. A living Edward V would have been a problem Henry could not ignore. Again, this does not prove Henry killed them. The truth of the princes in the Tower remains unresolved. But the DNA discovery changes the atmosphere around the question. It reminds us that the version of Richard passed down through centuries was not neutral. It came through Tudor victory, Tudor legitimacy needs, and Shakespearean drama. The body under the car park showed that at least part of the physical myth had been exaggerated. The Y chromosome mismatch showed that royal bloodlines could hide secrets. Together, they force us to treat the old narrative with more suspicion. That is the new storyline. Richard III's DNA did not solve the princes in the Tower. It solved something around them. It proved that the system judging Richard was itself built on uncertain blood, political storytelling, and legal performance. The people who called him a monster were not standing above propaganda. They were using it. Henry VII understood that power needed a story. He had won the crown by force, but force alone does not make a dynasty safe. A new dynasty needs moral shape. It needs the defeated king to look wicked and the victor to look chosen. Richard became the villain that made Tudor rule feel like justice. Then Shakespeare gave that villain immortality. That is why the DNA matters so much. It did not resurrect Richard as a saint. It resurrected him as a human being inside a propaganda machine. The bones showed pain. The wounds showed violence. The grave showed humiliation. The DNA showed identity. And the Y chromosome showed that even the royal family tree could not be treated as untouchable truth. Richard III's DNA did not make him a saint. It made him human again. His bones confirmed the king, exposed the propaganda, and revealed a hidden break in the royal line. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment what history should be reopened next.